Good morning, and welcome to Beyond the Headlines. We're your hosts, Alex Goldapel,
Daniela Marciano,
and Taya Coper.
This week, we will be discussing immigration policy in Canada. Beyond the Headlines is a weekly current affairs show that aims to make public policy discussions more accessible to you. We take you beyond the headlines of our daily news, bringing you access to current leaders through in-depth interviews. You can join us in the conversation by tweeting at Beyond the Headlines, that's BYOND_headlines.
In 2018, the Government of Canada released the first multi-year immigration levels plan, which sets targets for the amount of immigrants that Canada will admit from the years 2019 to 2021. According to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, the plan is designed to contribute to an immigration system that supports the middle class through economic growth, supports diversity, and helps build vibrant, dynamic, and inclusive communities, while maintaining border integrity to ensure the safety of Canadians. The plan is made up of Canada's federal immigration programs, which include economic class immigration, family class migration, as well as refugees and humanitarian claims. In total, Canada plans to admit over 1 million immigrants in this 3-year time span, an increase from the previous 2017 levels plan. In today's show, we will be discussing increasing Canada's population, economic migration, refugee policy, and settlement and integration policy.
We are joined by Doug Saunders from the Globe and Mail, Parisa Mavubi from the C.D. Howe Institute, Audrey Macklin from the University of Toronto, and John Shields from Ryerson University. Doug Saunders is the Globe and Mail's international affairs columnist. He previously ran the Globe's foreign bureaus in Los Angeles and London. He is a former winner of the National Newspaper Award and has also authored many books. Doug Saunders, thank you so much for joining me on the phone all the way from Germany.
A real pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
So in 2017, you published a book entitled Maximum Canada, Why 35 Million Canadians is Not Enough. Can you explain why that is, and what number do you think actually is enough?
I'm not a great believer in specific big numbers, although the subtitle of that book's latest edition is called Toward a Canada of 100 million. So, but that's less intended to be saying 100 million is the ideal population, rather than to say we need to be planning our infrastructure, planning our transition to a green economy, planning our cities, and planning our policies with the knowledge that our population is going to grow. It's certainly going to double this century. And for a number of reasons, it probably should triple. Now, that doesn't mean every country in the world is like that. Canada is almost unique in having problems of underpopulation in its economy and its civic life, maybe along with Australia and New Zealand. But underpopulation is not one of the big problems of the world. Depopulation is in some countries, but Canada is unique in having a population not up to its capacity.
So what are sort of the risks of underpopulation?
First, I should say, absolute population is a meaningless figure. I mean, more is not better when it comes to population. A lot of the most successful countries in the world are countries with quite small populations, like Switzerland and Norway and Israel, and a lot of the most unsuccessful countries in the world have absolutely huge populations. So it isn't a matter of sheer numbers, but it's a matter of capacity. It's a matter of density. It's a matter of having the right people in the right places to do the right thing. And Canada's problems are often caused by the fact that we do not have the market size, we do not have the audience size, we do not have the population density in cities to do the things that we want to do and that we need to do. We can't support, for example, a transition to a carbon neutral economy because our cities, even the largest ones, suffer from far too low population density to support such a transition. We have trouble doing the cultural things and the political things we want to do because we just don't have the tax base, we don't have the market size. And I think there are dangers in having a population of too low a density spread out over too far a space, over 5 time zones and 2 languages and 10 provinces and so on, that make it very difficult to do the things we want to do. We don't notice it so much now because Canada is a successful country and has a high standard of living. But the problems of capacity are going to sneak up on us. I think the 2030s and 2040s are going to be difficult decades in Canada for reasons of demographic change and so on. And also, the world is about to make a transition where the availability of newcomers, of immigrants, is going to shift to a much more difficult place, where we're used to having a surplus of people seeking to move around the world, and governments have tried to institute policies to control and limit the numbers. But most of the countries that send people are themselves shifting into having non-growing population. And I think within the next few decades, we'll reach a what I call peak people, a period where immigration becomes a seller's market rather than a buyer's market, and countries will be competing to offer better packages and better sponsorship deals and so on to people seeking to enter. And I think Canada needs to get a more sustainable population level before we reach that period where immigration becomes a much tougher thing for countries seeking people.
I think that's a very interesting perspective, and one that you maybe don't hear about quite often. So just picking up on what you were mentioning before, you were kind of talking about increased urban density and the need to grow our cities. At the beginning of the month, the editorial board of your paper, the Globe and Mail, published an editorial that said that Canadian cities need improved mass transit to deal with the expected urban population increase in Canada. In the GTA, there's estimates of 14 million within the next 20 to 30 years. But they were kind of skeptical of that getting done. What is your response to that editorial?
Well, I mean, Canada's three biggest cities, Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, all have problems of insufficient mass transit capacity. And I mean, as I point out in Maximum Canada, if you find yourself stuck on the King streetcar or on the Lionsgate Bridge or some road in Montreal in traffic that's not moving, it's not because your city is overcrowded. It's because your city is underpopulated. There's too low population density across the residential areas of Toronto to support mass transit, to support subway stations and things like that. Now, that's compounded by the fact that all three of those big cities have had problems with having political differences with the provincial governments. But that's bound to happen with big cities. A lot of them haven't made the right decisions with regard to tax policy and so on, so they're unable to raise enough revenue to do that. But again, that comes down to low population density. The areas of those cities that actually have a high population density are very small. I mean, Toronto has a huge area sort of ringing the downtown that's almost all single-family homes. I think something like a third of them have a family size of one person, and typically 4 or 5 bedrooms. And the population of most of those neighborhoods is shrinking. And in fact, if you look across the Golden Horseshoe in Ontario, about half of the neighborhoods have shrinking population. So we're not headed in a direction that makes it easy to make a transition to mass rapid transit. We have a lot of people moving into a few neighborhoods, and then we have a lot that are excluding housing growth and population density growth. And that's going to need to change, as not just because new immigrants are coming in, but because a new generation's growing up who have nowhere to live, who are stuck without transit.
Before you mentioned a little bit some of the environmental challenges that Canada will be facing in the upcoming decades and through the rest of the century. What is your response to some environmentalists like David Suzuki, for example, who argue that population increase of the size that you're kind of proposing is ecologically unsustainable?
There's a number of effects of the urban shift in populations, which is sort of what population growth in Canada is defined by. Canada as an urban country. On one hand, somebody who becomes an urban resident of the developed world consumes more energy than somebody who is a subsistence level farmer, right? I mean, having a lifestyle that puts you and your children on sort of a fine line between life and death does not tend to consume a lot of watts of energy. But second of all, when people make that rural to urban transition, which includes most international immigration, their family size goes down dramatically, from an average of something like 6 or 7 children per family to an average of less than 2. So the average number of people per family goes down. In fact, countries that send immigrants to developed countries, so the countries that send the people who become immigrants to Canada, for example, tend to have population growth rates that are falling below 2 children per family, whereas the countries that don't send people as international immigrants, usually because they're too poor. It's not the poorest countries don't send immigrants. They're the ones with the out of control population growth. So it helps the growing population. But I think the most important factor is that once you get above a certain population density in cities and a certain income level in cities, the per capita energy usage starts going down dramatically with each additional person, right? Because you're able to substitute lengthier journeys by usually private automobile with electrified public transit journeys or walking or bicycle. You're able to replace extremely energy efficient types of housing, such as single family houses on lots, with much more green forms of housing, such as multi-unit dwellings built using modern building standards and so on. And you're able to replace inefficient electricity generation techniques with much more efficient carbon neutral techniques. So it's important to get cities and also larger regions into a level of population density that allows a green transition, that allows an ecological transition, that allows the creation of economies of scale and the building of green infrastructure that's only possible above a certain population density level. So the net effect for a country like Canada, which is already underpopulated, of increasing the population density, not the absolute population, but the concentrations of population, is a net ecological benefit. On top of that, we're about to reach a point where the cost of climate change is going to become very high for countries like Canada. On top of our commitments necessary to shift to a carbon neutral economy so that we can prevent global warming from exceeding a 2-degree limit, we're going to have huge costs associated with protecting cities, protecting coastal areas, and so on, against the physical and climatological damage of warming. And that's going to get more expensive the longer we wait, but it's also going to get more expensive if we have a low population density, if we do not have the concentrations of people to make it easier to do that. And if we have a shrinking revenue base, then the public cost of that is going to become difficult to sustain, because we already have an aging population. So in the 2030s and 2040s, we're going to have the health costs for provincial governments go from like 35% to like 45-50% of provincial government budgets, no matter what we do. We're going to have a lot of the other costs of aging eat bigger slices of the budget pie federally and provincially. So we're going to be fiscally squeezed, and we're going to have huge extra costs of climate change. So we need to have a growing population. We need to have a productive population to be causing the economic activity that allows us to pay for the transition and to a carbon neutral economy and the protection against climate damage. So for a number of reasons, Canada's ecological future is unsustainable at its current population level.
So would it be accurate to kind of summarize your position as Canada needs a population increase to maintain or to improve our current quality of life?
I'd put it the other way around. I'd say if we don't start planning for the population increase that is going to happen and for a larger increase that should happen, then there could be damage to our quality of life. One of the things that Canada has failed to do throughout its history is anticipate population changes that are going to occur. And you can look at that in Toronto. Right now, we are begging for financing in Toronto for public transit improvements to deal with the population growth that occurred in the 1980s and 1990s. Right, so we're planning and attempting to plan for population growth that occurred a quarter of a century ago. We should be planning and spending money for the population growth that's going to occur over the next 50 years or 75 years or even 100 years. Canada's not been good at doing that. We don't tend to look ahead. We tend to play catch up. And that was true with the huge population and economic growth that happened after the Second World War. I mean, suddenly we'd notice that we needed to build 400 more high schools or something like that because we didn't expect the population to grow. We thought we'd have limited immigration. We thought the population would grow slowly, but the economy boomed. And when the economy booms, you get immigration.
Doug Saunders, thank you so much for taking the time.
Really good to talk to you. Thanks.
Once again, that was Doug Saunders speaking about his book, Maximum Canada, Why 35 Million Canadians is Not Enough. Our next guest is Parisa Mabubi from the C.D. Howe Institute.
Dr. Parisa Mabubi is a senior policy analyst and leads the C.D. Howe Institute's Human Capital Policy Council. Her research interest focuses on social policy with a concentration on demographic, skills, education, and labor market concerns. I had the pleasure of speaking with Parisa, and she had some valuable insights in terms of immigration and its effect on the labor market in Canada, as well as the issue of job skills mismatch. Thank you very much, Parisa, for joining us today. My first question for you is, what kinds of skills are immigrants bringing to Canada, and what sectors do immigrants typically work in?
First of all, thank you for having me. In general, immigrants to Canada are more likely to be educated, and therefore they are equipped with various sets of skills. And the distribution of industries based on their educational background varies, and in some industry they are more likely to work in than others. For example, because of their educational background, they are more likely to be employed in high-paying industries such as finance, insurance, real estate, as well as professional, scientific, and technical services industries.
And are there any sectors that are lacking employees in Canada that immigrants could perhaps supplement?
Yes, because of different factors, including the aging of the population. We are facing labor and skills shortages in some industries. For example, when we look at a specific measure like unemployment to vacancy ratio, we find that two industries of finance and insurance and healthcare and social assistance show the signs of shortages. Another industry that also faces some skill and labor shortages is information and communication technology sector.
In terms of Canada's aging population, what role does immigration play in ensuring that Canada maintains its competitive labor force?
Higher immigration can mitigate the impacts of demographic change on the workforce and Canada's age structure, because immigrants are relatively younger than the already resident population. In fact, immigration has been the major contributor to Canada's population and labor force growth. Without immigration, Canada is not able to sustain a positive labor force growth, basically.
In terms of Canada's changing economic future in the landscape, with regards to kind of sector transformation in terms of transitioning off of fossil fuels, for instance, and the development of new technologies, what role do immigrants play in this regard?
And the role of immigrants is really important because in light of rapid technological changes, as well as even demographic change as we discussed, attracting talent is become more and more important to economic growth. Skills-biased technological changes influence demand for skills, which cause some skills imbalances in the labor market. With new technology, businesses increase their demands for higher skilled workers while reducing their demand for middle skilled workers. So immigration is a nimble way to fulfill Canada's skills need and address industry labor shortages in the short term.
So this past September, you authored a report entitled Bad Fits, the Causes, Extent, and Costs of Job Skills Mismatch in Canada. Can you explain to us a little bit the questions that were guiding your research and what exactly prompted you to write this report?
Basically, in this study, I wanted to measure skills mismatch in Canada and the extent and realize and understand who are facing basically larger skills mismatch in Canada. We all know that skills are essential for individual success in the labor market, and a highly skilled workforce can adjust more quickly to changes in the labor market. But skills need to match properly with job requirements to boost productivity and obtain outcomes that are desirable for workers, employers, and society at large. Although some skills mismatch is unavoidable and it's sometimes it's temporary, a widespread and persistent skills mismatching of skills to jobs basically need to be addressed. Otherwise, we would have problem in terms of productivity at the labor market.
Why is there this problem of skills mismatching in Canada, would you say?
Basically, a skills mismatch happens when a worker has higher or lower levels of skills that the job required for a specific job requires some sort of skills. If a worker has higher or lower levels of skills, we call that worker to be mismatched for the job. So there are two forms of skills mismatch: underskilling and overskilling, and both can have some consequences for both workers and employers.
Where do immigrants fit in terms of being either overskilled or underskilled?
In general, what the study shows that there are significant variation across socioeconomic groups, including immigrants. In general, immigrants are more likely to be underskilled for their jobs. But the good news about immigrants is that as they spend more time in Canada, the underskilling problem of immigrants entirely disappears. And this highlights basically the importance of settlement policies that provide rigorous and accessible skills training and language programs and job search workshops for newcomers.
Integration policies are key here in terms of
definitely.
how newcomers fit into the labor market and how they acquire new skills, learn new skills, and essential things such as learning the language, what have you.
The skills mismatch that I measured in my paper was based on three basic skills: numeracy, literacy, and problem-solving skills. And the data shows that in different paper, basically, I have shown that language ability of immigrants plays really important role in enabling them to perform well in these type of skills. So when the language ability problem gets solved, so they would have sufficient levels of skills to be able to perform their job. Another tool to make basically to help immigrants is to provide them with job search workshops, so they become more familiar with the labor market, Canadian labor market basically, and to be able to find the jobs that is right for their skills.
What do you say towards Canada kind of recognizing other qualifications from countries? So when newcomers come over and they've been trained previously in some sort of skill, some sort of professional vocation, and then they come to Canada and they're unable to find work because their skills aren't recognized, they're not transferable. What kind of barriers do those present for newcomers?
Definitely one of, in addition to individuals' characteristics, government's policy can contribute to a skills mismatch in general for all individuals, including immigrants. And the policy, basically, the main policy to tackle the skills mismatches in the labor market is through labor mobility policies and training and education policies, basically. So when immigrants come to Canada, if they are not able to use the education and the skills that they were trained for in their own country, and they are not able to find the job that matches their skills. So by facilitating and also by basically improving labor mobility in regulated occupations, because immigrants, again, they are more educated and they are more likely to train and obtain education in regulated occupations. So by easing labor mobility within those occupations, we're going to improve labor market outcomes, reducing skills mismatch in the labor market for immigrants.
Were there any findings in your report that stood out to you in particular?
Basically, what the research shows, other than the overall results, that there is a degree of skills mismatch in Canada, and also highlights which group of population they face higher incidence of a skills mismatch. The paper highlighted that basically, although in general Canada stands compared to other developed countries, we are in a good position, and we are not facing high levels of skills mismatch in the labor market. But there are some reasons for concerns. Again, as I said, because some population group face higher incidence of skills mismatch in the labor market. And also another important thing to consider is that skills mismatch problem can worsen in the years ahead as the labor market is evolving because of technological development and workforce aging and growing role of newcomers in Canada's labor force. So we are facing basically Canada's labor market is aging. And also, we are welcoming more new immigrants to Canada. So all these factors is going to affect skills mismatch in Canada. And also, the skills mismatch that I look at was based on three basic skills. But when we look at broader sets of skills, such as information and communication technology, interpersonal, decision-making, and physical skills, the study shows that 92% of Canadians, they think they don't have the right skills for their job. Basically, they face a skills mismatch in the labor market. And this is really important for the government to look at this issue, especially as I said, the population is aging and we are facing technological changes.
Anti-immigration sentiment is harmful for immigration and for the labor market, but just how harmful is this anti-immigration sentiment, especially as we saw with the recent federal election, with the rise of the People's Party of Canada? So what do you say to that, to anti-immigration sentiment?
Just looking at the demographic change, it should alert policymakers and individuals about the changes that comes to the labor market, and realizing that without immigration, Canada is not able to sustain a positive labor force growth. So without labor force growth, it's the economy as a whole is going to be affected, and employers are not able to fill the jobs. And also because of the pressure, basically not only through labor force, and also the impact on tax base are becoming important to immigration, because if government wants to provide services to Canadians, it needs to collect to be able to collect enough taxes to finance services. So immigration is not only contribute to population growth and labor force growth, also contribute to the sustainability of government finance and contribute to the tax base.
Parisa, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, that was Parisa Mahboobi speaking about economic migration. Next, we're joined by Audrey Macklin, who is a professor and chair in human rights at the University of Toronto. She is currently the director of the Centre for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies. She teaches, researches, and publishes on all aspects of migration and citizenship law. She has also adjudicated refugee claims for Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board. The 2019 to 2021 Levels Plan aims to admit approximately 45,000 to 51,000 refugees per year. Refugees in humanitarian cases make up the smallest portion of the Levels Plan when compared to other types of immigrants, such as economic class. In your opinion, do you generally think there is enough representation of refugees in the annual Levels Plan?
I think that there is always room for more. Certainly, when you look at private sponsorship, there's an argument one can make that there should be no ceiling on the number of refugees that can be privately sponsored. If there are Canadians willing to come together and do the heavy lifting, why would the government want to stand in the way?
So just going off of that, Canada is often praised for its privately sponsored program, and it is seen as a model around the world. What do you think are some implications of this? Are we just placing the onus on Canadians to bear the costs associated with refugees rather than having the government be responsible?
So with respect to privately sponsored refugees, it has long been the position of those who are the institutional players in private sponsorship, and here I mean sponsorship agreement holders, that private sponsorship should always and only be understood as supplementary, as something that is done in addition to the government-assisted refugee or public sponsorship program. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is, as you hinted, it is critical that the reception of refugees not be regarded as a private responsibility, but rather one that is primarily and in the first instance a public responsibility that we owe as a country and that the government fulfills on our behalf. Secondly, if the government doesn't exhibit a commitment to resettling refugees, then it will be hard to sustain the motivation for private actors to step up if they imagine that they are doing work that, in quotes, the government is supposed to do. If they understand themselves as doing something in addition to what the public responsibility is, then you can get, I think, some buy-in. This is one of the issues about the apparent attempt to sort of export the private sponsorship model to other countries that don't have a robust public model of resettlement. I think it is difficult for those models to take root in countries, particularly countries that have a strong history of a social safety net, a welfare system. It's hard to persuade private citizens about why they should undertake what should otherwise be a public responsibility. So, in short, this principle that sponsorship agreement holders call additionality is critical to sustaining and promoting any system of private refugee sponsorship.
What do you think are some of the strongest benefits to a country that is receiving refugees, and particularly Canada in general?
The benefits to Canada of admitting refugees are of a piece with the benefits to Canada of admitting newcomers generally. So refugees are distinguished from other newcomers because of the reasons for their flight. They leave their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution for grounds related to the Refugee Convention. But those people also bring with them the skills, talents, ambition, motivation that lots of other immigrants in other categories bring. It's true that they may not all be as highly skilled as those who are in the economic class who are selected for skills. It may be that they don't have as many relatives in Canada as those who enter as members of the family class. But refugees have skills. Refugees have family as well. So they bring the general benefits that we associate with newcomers to Canada. They also, of course, help Canada fulfill the international legal obligations that it voluntarily undertook when signing the Refugee Convention. And they also, through resettlement, help promote international cooperation in sharing the responsibility for assisting refugees that would otherwise fall disproportionately, and indeed currently does fall disproportionately, on countries of first asylum in the Global South.
So you mentioned the Refugee Convention, and since refugees are essentially an issue of human rights, do you think Canada is upholding its human rights obligations in this area?
Canada has an international legal obligation not to send refugees back to a country where they will face persecution. It voluntarily signed on to that obligation by acceding to the Refugee Convention. But what Canada does, in fact, and in doing it, it behaves like many other countries, is use every tool it has to prevent asylum seekers from reaching Canada and asking for the protection that Canada has promised them in the Refugee Convention. So examples of how it does that are, for example, visa requirements that are designed to deny visas to anybody who the government fears might make a refugee claim. The government has a safe third country agreement with the United States that is designed to deter and prevent refugees from reaching Canada and deflect them back to the United States. So Canada expends an enormous amount of time and resource in preventing those who need refugee protection from ever reaching Canada. It does admit those who it picks and chooses, and that's the resettlement process. But resettlement is not a legal obligation. And so in terms of numbers and undertakings, it is in comparative context, in comparison to the number of refugees in the world, in comparison to the asylum seekers in some European states, in comparison to the number of refugees in the Global South, it's trivial.
So going off of the Safe Third Country Act with the United States, and can you talk a little bit about the concept of non-refoulement and how it relates to the Safe Third Country Act?
When Canada signed the Refugee Convention, it promised that if somebody arrived at our border, or indeed was in the country, and they faced a well-founded fear of persecution in their country of nationality, they would not be returned to that country. So the Refugee Convention forbids Canada from returning people to a country where they might face persecution. But Canada, like other countries, found a loophole in that. The convention says you can't send people back to their country of nationality, but it doesn't say anything about sending them to some other country. So Canada exploits this loophole by saying, okay, we're not going to send asylum seekers who arrive through the United States back to their country of origin. We will instead send them back to the United States, where, in theory, they have the opportunity to acquire refugee protection because the United States is also a place that fulfills its international legal obligation to protect refugees. So the flaw in that argument, among other things, is the assumption that the United States is a safe place to seek and obtain refugee protection. If it ever was, I think it's safe to say that it's not now. And yet Canada persists in enforcing this agreement, which means that people who are deflected from Canada back to the United States under the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement are at risk of having their human rights violated in the United States by practices like detention, family separation, and so on. And they also face refoulement from the United States back to their country of nationality because of the various ways in which the United States does not actually give those asylum seekers a genuine opportunity to make a refugee claim and obtain protection.
So if an individual is able to make a refugee claim, can you explain the process that an individual goes through when making the claim at the Immigration and Refugee Board, what the hearing is like, and how the decision is ultimately made?
I'll first describe the regular process, and then I will describe the most recent changes to it. If a person is found eligible to make a refugee claim, and broadly speaking, that means that they are not ineligible on grounds of national security, serious criminality, or because they already have refugee protection elsewhere, they are then allowed to present their refugee claim to a member of the Immigration and Refugee Board. The IRB is an independent tribunal, and the member who decides the claim is tasked with evaluating and assessing whether the reasons why the individual fled their country and came to Canada meet the refugee definition. This involves both determinations of credibility, whether the account that the person is providing is viewed as believable, and secondly, whether accepting that it is credible, whether it adds up to a refugee claim. The refugee definition is very narrow, so there are lots of forms of suffering and deprivation that are serious and significant, but don't fall within the narrow definition of the Refugee Convention. If that person is accepted as a refugee, they then go on to become a permanent resident. Refugee claimants are entitled to legal representation. If they can pay for it themselves, they can hire a lawyer. If they can't, there is limited legal aid available in some provinces. Now, in response to the irregular border crossings over the last couple of years, particularly since the election of President Trump, the Canadian government has been under some pressure, particularly from opposition parties, to respond to the entry of people between border posts. To explain that, you have to go back to the Safe Third Country Agreement. So until the Safe Third Country Agreement went into force in 2004, that is about a little over 15 years ago, refugee claimants who came up through the United States would go to a port of entry and ask for refugee protection. They do that now as well at airports and marine ports. But because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, they can't do that anymore. They will be deflected back to the United States. Since Trump's election, more people have been crossing the border between designated ports of entry. In other words, just walking across the border in spots where Canada doesn't have a port of entry. Those are the people who are called irregular or border crossers. It's important to say here that it is not an offense under Canadian immigration law to cross the border between official ports of entry. The requirement under immigration law, is that the person who who crosses the border between ports of entry should go without delay to a port of entry. And in fact, that seems to be what is happening, because they are crossing the border into the chilly embrace of the RCMP, who take them to a port of entry. To the extent that there's any violation of Canadian law in crossing a border between border posts, it's a violation of the Customs Act because of the concern that people might be bringing goods across the border for which they are not being charged duty. But to the best of my knowledge, not a single irregular border crosser has been charged under the Customs Act for, cross-border shopping in the United States and bringing over goods that they're not declaring. So, with that as a background, it's important to know that there has been a rise in these so-called irregular border entries that is directly attributable to the existence of the Safe Third Country Agreement and, of course, the current situation in the United States. That irregular border crossing could be halted immediately if the Safe Third Country Agreement was suspended or revoked. But that's not what's happened. Instead, the Canadian government has adopted a new law in the Budget Implementation Act. And that law says that if anybody who first arrived in one of the so-called Five Eyes countries, and here that we mean the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and made a refugee claim in those countries, and subsequently comes to Canada and makes a refugee claim, they will not have access to the process I described before the Immigration and Refugee Board. Instead, they will be restricted to what I will just call a very expedited process before somebody who is not an independent decision maker, somebody who works for the Border Enforcement Agency, known as the Canadian Border Services Agency, and who will be tasked with making what's called a pre-removal risk assessment. That process has not typically involved an oral hearing. The people who make that decision are border guards, not people who are independent from government. And historically, that pre-removal risk assessment has had a success rate in the single digits. What I do understand, and it is not, somewhat anecdotal, is that the number of irregular border crossers who, in fact, have made refugee claims in the United States is relatively small anyway. But that, then, is a separate and inferior process for refugee determination that now exists in Canada alongside the one I described earlier.
Once again, that was Audrey Macklin speaking about Canadian refugee policy. Our next guest is John Shields from Ryerson University.
Dr. John Shields is a tenured full professor at Ryerson University with over 25 years of university teaching and research experience in the areas of Canadian politics, the political economy of labor and welfare state restructuring, as well as immigrant settlement and integration policy and practices. In 2016, he was the recipient of the Dean's Excellence Award for Research and Impact. Dr. Shields has published extensively, including the co-authoring of 5 books and over 40 published articles and papers, and an extensive number of policy papers and conference presentations. Professor John Shields, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the program today.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
My first question for you is, this past October, you were part of a study, you were one of the project leads on a study called the Immigrant Settlement Ecosystem in Canada, an Ontario case study. Could you just tell us a little bit what you mean by the phrase settlement ecosystem?
Yeah, so it relates really to the complexity of the immigrant settlement and integration process. So it really is the sum total of factors that account for immigrant performance, how successful immigrants are able to settle in Canada. So basically you can't just consider settlement services in isolation, but what we really need to do is to treat it in and understand it in a more holistic type of fashion. So, for example, we have various settlement services. Actually, we know from our study and other studies that they have lots of success in terms of promoting integration, but they're not by any stretch of the imagination the only factors, right? It really depends on things also like the labor market. Are we in recession when immigrants come? What are the barriers within the labor market that may help or prevent immigrants from integrating adequately? Also, what's the warmth, for example, of the welcome in Canada? Is the population accepting of newcomers? Or are there lots of issues like prejudice and so forth? Are there other policies in place that help to promote integration? And, for Canada, I would note things like multiculturalism policy, which speaks, very directly to welcoming difference and recognizing difference, celebrating difference, various anti-racism policies and so forth. So all of these and many more factors, we really have to sort of consider in terms of the settlement system. So it's basically a call to say, well, we can't look at this in isolation. We've got to look at this in a more holistic kind of way.
In the study, what were some of the main questions that you were asking? What were the main questions that were guiding you in this research project?
Yeah, well, this was a study that was funded by the Federal Immigration Department, IRCC. And the focus of it was, first of all, to look at some of the groups that are, particularly vulnerable in the immigrant population. And so, the areas were looking at women, it was looking at youth, it was looking at seniors. And I had the responsibility of looking at the youth dimension of this, and then looking, more holistically at the settlement system. The second part of it was looking at what was the impact of settlement services on outcomes. So a lot of studies certainly looked at issues of settlement and integration, but a lot of the studies haven't looked as, kind of directly at the role and impact of settlement services upon this process. And so our task was to really look at this, and basically the study had two phases. Phase one was doing a literature review, so what does the literature say about this, the academic literature, the gray literature, and then doing more primary-based research for the second phase, which was going out and actually doing fairly extensive interviews and focus groups with settlement workers, with immigrants themselves from these three groupings, and also with key informants, which would include, government officials and other people involved in the immigrant settlement, broadly speaking, system.
Were there any findings in particular that stood out to you?
Yeah, sure. I think, we came up with, in total we did, 8 different reports. So there's lots of different areas of findings.
Okay.
I guess a few of them that stand out, is the complexity of measuring outcomes of success.
Mm-hmm.
And some areas in terms of settlement are a little bit perhaps easier to measure a bit more quantitatively. Like if you're looking at language acquisition, for example, you can kind of, do measures about how different immigrants are becoming more literate in one of the key 2 official languages. Even things like employment outcomes, we can sort of measure where somebody is employed, not employed. Do they have skills commensurate in employment in their areas? Other areas which are a bit softer, right, are a lot more difficult to measure. How are they integrating more generally within society? These are more qualitative types of measures. I think one of the factors here is that, we have to be aware of just how complex measuring is and how we sort of determine what is success, how we sort of measure success. This is not a straightforward type of thing.
No, yeah. It's a key question of program evaluation.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. And so I think, the qualitative dimensions are really important to this, and I think our study really brought this to the fore. I mean, there's many, many other types of findings. I think, the appropriateness of programs that are more culturally sensitive to the groups, the identification of targeted programs, especially for the more vulnerable, are really, I think, important. I think the value, I think it reinforces the idea of the value of the Canadian approach to settlement, which is, government-funded services but run through the nonprofit sector, because the nonprofit sector really has a particular approach to caring, provides more of a human touch in terms of the services, and these I think have proven they're much less bureaucratic in that regard, and these I think have proven to be more successful, and of course this is a system that is widely studied by many other countries, so I think it speaks to some of the successes of our type of approach to immigration and settlement.
In terms of barriers that newcomers face, what are some of the more challenging barriers that
well, some of them,
face?
are not going to be any surprise.
No.
One is, of course, language, and this is not just sort of general speaking ability or reading ability in one of the official languages, but attaining, the language of business is much more, culturally nuanced. The other is, many of the barriers that continue to exist in the labor market, which includes, this kind of bias towards the idea of Canadian experience, which of course newcomers generally do not have. Their need to get social capital, to make connections and to bond with others in society, because in terms of getting integrated socially, but also in terms of the labor market, most jobs are not jobs that are advertised; they're jobs that go through various kinds of networks in this country. So those are, I think, some of the key things that of course, also came out in our study. I think, in addition, in terms of settlement services themselves, it's things like problems and issues around access and availability. For a lot of people who are newcomers, they have very limited resources. So the ability to actually get to services that are offered can be a challenge. Our transport, is transport available? Is it affordable? How long does it take to get there? For women, of course, it's things like childcare. Often there are services, but if there's no childcare, the access to them can be a real challenge. Other things are, do not all newcomers necessarily qualify for the services? If you are a temporary migrant, for example, you probably don't qualify for many of the services that are offered by, funded by the federal government. So these, I think, are some of the major sort of barriers.
And would you say there are some groups that who face greater barriers than others? I know you focused on youth in this project.
Yeah, for sure. Those are some of the groups that face special barriers. We know in terms of women, they're not just women, but they're also often women who are visible minorities, so they can face double forms of discrimination within the labor market and within society. I mentioned the whole thing around childcare, which is a major issue for women. For youth, they are often facing barriers in terms of, again, race and visible minority status, but also they're sort of also trying to bridge different cultures, but also the different generations at the same time. So, all youth are facing, generational types of issues. But immigrant youth have this extra sort of issue to deal with, which can really make life isolating and complex. For immigrant seniors, they have particular barriers, especially if they're more recently arrived. If they've come to Canada more recently, they're going to be sponsored by their children or relatives. So they don't all necessarily have access to all of the services. These are, because they're sponsored refugees, the relatives are responsible for providing their economic well-being for a period of up to 10 years. And they can be face isolation in the home. They may even be exploited sometimes by family members. They often don't have the same sort of language capacities. And then as they're aging, of course, they're also facing many of the same sort of challenges as other aging individuals in our society. but they've got these other, cultural issues, and then lack of access to services to deal with these. So, these three groups are for sure some of the most vulnerable among the migrant populations in our society.
And how does Ontario fare in comparison to other provinces in terms of being a destination for immigrants?
It's hard to speak about the province as a whole. I mean, I think Ontario does fairly well overall. But I think you actually have to kind of break this down a little bit further. So like large centers like Ontario, on some levels do quite well because they're really rich in terms of the services that are offered to newcomers. There's a dense networks of organizations that provide services and so forth. You have a transportation system that's more comprehensive in terms of the ability to sort of get around the city, to access those services. If you go to some of the smaller communities, they may not have organizations that provide many of the services. So, the services may not be available. The transportation may be far more limited. When we were doing some of our interviews, for example, in Windsor, one of the big issues that came up was the lack of adequate transportation because of, fairly poor public transit to be able to get to the programming. So that's not generally a problem. The cost may be a problem, but it's not generally a problem in terms of being able to use public transit to get to a system in some of the larger centers like Toronto. The suburbs as well, right, where many new immigrants are coming these days because of affordability within the city. They are not nearly as well resourced in terms of organizations providing programming as is the city of Toronto itself. So it's a bit of a patchwork in that regard. And then we see this also, sort of across the country where, the larger cities tend to be much richer in terms of resources that are available. Smaller centers and certainly rural areas are much more limited in that regard, and that provides, often difficulty for newcomers. But of course, in the large cities, of course, the other challenge is that often it's much more expensive. So that provides its own set of barriers to especially more recent newcomers.
Professor John Shields, thank you so much for coming on the program with us today. I think that's all the time we have, but I'd just like to thank you for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Once again, that was John Shields speaking about settlement and integration policy. You have been listening to Beyond the Headlines. Many thanks to Doug Saunders, Parisa Mabubi, Audrey Macklin, and John Shields for joining us to discuss immigration policy in Canada. Today's show was produced by Alex Goldapel, Daniela Marciano, and Taya Coper.
The views expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the producers, CIUT, or the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. If you missed any part of the show, be sure to check out podcasts of all our episodes on our website at www.beyondtheheadlines.net. If you're a fan of our show or want to stay up to date with policy issues in Canada, follow us on Twitter at Beyond_headlines. That's BYOND_headlines. You can also check us out on Facebook or Instagram.
Be sure to tune in next week as we continue to take public policy discussions out of the hallways and onto the airwaves.